When we think about the Great War, we usually consider the experience of the infantry soldier, both because those soldiers always make up the bulk of armies, and because most of the texts we associate with the war come from the point of view of the infantry. However, the war on the sea and in the air was important as well. As was the case in the land armies, the navies of the combatant nations had seen a number of technological innovations that made the Great War different from preceding wars. The most important of these was the use of oil fuel rather than coal to power the ships. An oil-fueled ship could travel faster for longer with a smaller contingent of workers to fuel the engines than a coal-fueled ship could. The switch from coal to oil was happening as the 20th century dawned, and both the British and the German navies were converting ships to oil fuel as well as building new, modern battleships to replace aging coal-fueled ships. The British Navy was the pride of the nation. For hundreds of years, it was the dominant navy of not just Europe, but of the world. It bears primary responsibility for Britain's success as a colonial power. Because it was the most prestigious of the British military branches, it had enjoyed good funding for a very long time, and it was the most modern and efficient navy in the world at the time of the Great War's beginning. By contrast, Germany was not a naval power. It was known for its army, and particularly for its Prussian officers and infantrymen, who had a reputation for being brave, ruthless, and well-disciplined. Those of you who have studied the American Revolution may remember that it was a Prussian officer who helped George Washington turn a ragtag group of farmers into an efficient army capable of defeating the world's great military power of the day. So Prussia's reputation was of long standing and was well deserved. The Germans knew and feared the power of the British Navy. The British Navy had been blockading Germany since the beginning of the war, preventing the industrial nation from importing the raw materials it needed to run its factories and feed its people. Germany had been running a U-boat or submarine campaign since the beginning of the war, preying on both military and commercial vessels. But the U-boats were of necessity solitary hunters, and the British quickly figured out that one way to avoid catastrophic losses was to send ships in convoys so they could protect one another. Really, the most important effect that the U-boat campaign had on the war was irritating the United States so much by sinking its commercial and passenger ships that they drew it into the war, just at the point when both the Allied and Central Powers were nearly out of resources. The entry of the U.S. into the war after the sinking of the Lusitania proved decisive, bringing to the Allies a fresh source of soldiers, food, and war materials. Germany wanted to stop the British Navy's blockade, and so it made a risky foray into open waters to engage the British fleet at the Battle of Jutland. This 1916 battle was dramatic, with ships sailing through fog banks and suddenly encountering the enemy, the sun shifting position during the course of the day, giving the advantage to first one and then the other side, and the discovery of design flaws in their ships by both navies. At the end of the day, the British Navy had suffered more losses than the German, but the German Navy was so much smaller and had so many fewer trained sailors that it limped back to port, never to emerge again during the war. The British had command of the sea, and the Germans faced the prospect of winning the war on the Western Front, or not at all. The defeat of the German Navy at Jutland is important because by 1916, both sides had long realized that the battlefield conditions of Flanders and northern France favored stalemate. The terrain was too flat and soggy to advantage either side, and both sides were well entrenched in defensive positions that were difficult for the other side to move. Thus, both the Germans and the English had been looking for ways to move the war to some other venue, the sea for Germany, Gallipoli for the British. The other great technological innovation of the Great War was aerial warfare. The Wright brothers had succeeded in the first powered flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903, about 10 years before the war began. By the time the war started, airplanes were still fairly flimsy contraptions of wood and fabric. Initially, they were used for observation, because neither side had figured out yet how to fire a gun from a plane. Airplanes were used in a limited way for bombing, but their range was quite short, and they could carry only a limited amount of weight, so that a plane might have only a couple of bombs that could be heaved over the side of the plane with crossed fingers that they would land on something worth blowing up. Airplanes could get above the battlefield and see the terrain, make observations of enemy action, and carry photographers and map makers to record what they saw. Of course, a plane flying at relatively low altitude above the battlefield was conspicuous, and so snipers, machine gunners, and even regular artillery would generally try to hit the plane to bring it down. What changed the utility of the airplane in battle was development of a synchronized propeller and machine gun. Once that problem had been solved, a pilot could fire a machine gun out the front of his airplane without shooting off his own propeller, which made dogfights possible. Eventually, both sides developed skills in aerial combat, with the Germans being the leaders in these innovations. Oswald Belke, considered the father of the German Air Force, was the primary innovator in aerial combat tactics, teaching students, including Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, tactics of aerial combat that are still used by pilots today. From their beginnings as mere observers, airplanes became important weapons and the air an important battleground in the war. Airplanes were not the only flying ships that were important to World War I combatants, though. Both sides used observation balloons on the front lines to gather intelligence on what the other side was up to. Because balloon observers were tethered to the ground, stationary over the battlefield, the opposing side usually amused itself by taking potshots at them, leading to the highest rate of shell shock among any combatants. Some medical professionals suspect this is because the observers were helpless to move, either to fight back or to take cover. Zeppelins were the main aircraft used by the German army to bomb Britain. In a preview of the Second World War, Germany engaged in bombing runs over civilian targets during the First World War. Again, these bombing runs were fairly rudimentary. There was still no way to target where bombs would fall. The bomber really just dropped them over the side and hoped for the best. Zeppelins were, I'm sure, quite majestic, but they were also very slow-moving and filled with flammable hydrogen, which was not a good combination when your enemy was developing anti-aircraft guns. Because bombing in the Great War was so haphazard, it wasn't very deadly, but it was somewhat effective as a terror weapon. Civilians feared it because the bombs were so random, not because they were so widespread. This week, you'll read some history of the air and naval wars, as well as the next section of the Wipers Times, the BEF Times. Our poor Sherwood Foresters had been moved about so much, they gave up on trying to name the paper after the place they were stationed, and took on the most generic name they could think of. BEF stands for British Expeditionary Force, the official name of the British Army contingent in France. This is a post-Somme era for the Trench newspaper. As you read this week, think about how the paper talks about the experience of the war in this altogether grimmer and less hopeful phase. You may notice that in the very first number, the editors are having some fun with the tanks, which debuted at the beginning of the Battle of the Somme in July 1916. Who and what else provides an object of fun for the Wipers Times editors?